Welcome to the cruising station on vertical team meetings, scaled scoring, and STAR. When looking at the rigor trajectory of Get Better Faster, the very first action step under Phase 1 is understanding end goal assessments, identifying what students need to know and show to be successful. The end goal assessments that we must analyze are just as varied as the grade levels and content areas that we teach. Some of us might focus on STAR or EOC, others the SAT, ACT, or TSIA. Still others might look at a MIRA or IXL assessment data, or even performance tasks for elective courses. This video is made primarily for teacher leaders who lead and coach in STAR or EOC assessed courses, and works especially well with PLCs or vertical teams because the focus is on better understanding test design and scaled scoring. So let's build some background knowledge about item difficulty and assessment weight. Think about an important readiness standard for your grade level. Every year, test writers develop questions for each student expectation at different difficulty levels. Look at the graphic with yellow circles. Since all of the circles are the same color, that means they assess the same standard, perhaps the one you're thinking about. Small circles equal less difficult questions and thus lower weight. Large circles equal more difficult questions worth more weight. The weight of the item is determined by the difficulty level, not the number of points. STAR 2.0 questions are not always the highest difficulty level. This time, the circles are all different colors, meaning all different standards. The test is designed to meet an overall difficulty level represented by the blue STAR test bowl at the bottom of your screen. Bowls have to meet a specific level of difficulty year after year. Look at the olive green circles in the bowl. That means there are 2 test questions assigned to that standard. One, a more difficult test item, we might call it a meets level question, and another represented by the smaller green circle, well, that one is written at a lower difficulty level. We might call that one an approaches level question. Questions are written to assess the breadth and depth of a student expectation. Let's look now at some example released STAR questions. We're going to look and see what meets different difficulty levels. And as we go, I want you to think about the 3 questions on the screen. What is the student being asked to do? How does it assess the student expectation? And what knowledge does the student need to answer the question? We're going to look at 5th grade math as an example for this video. If you decide to turn this around in a PLC or vertical team, you can go to Lead Forward's IQ item analysis to copy-paste items for your specific grade levels and content areas. The link is in the notes at the bottom of this slide and can be found in the Teacher Leader Google Classroom. So let's look at this 5th grade standard and test question. This standard asks students to simplify numerical expressions that do not involve exponents, including up to 2 levels of grouping. The specific test question asks which expression does not have a value of 24. And the students then simplify those 4 expressions, one of which will not have a value of 24. Thinking about those questions on the previous screen, how does this question assess the student expectation? And what knowledge would a student need to answer the question correctly? If we were all together face to face, I would ask you to write a prediction, whether you think this is a level 1, 2, 3, or 4 question type. But since we're not, I'm going to just go ahead and tell you the difficulty level of this question. Here's the answer. This meets the standard at the most basic level, approaches. How do we know? Because before this test question is an item on STAR, it's first a field test item. On this field test item, 87% of students correctly answered the question, so it's on the lesser end of difficulty and thus less weight. Notice how there's no story problem, no real world context, And also notice that the numbers given are relatively easy to work with. They're all single digits or two-digit numbers. Now let's look at another assessment item, again, still tied to this same standard, but perhaps at a different difficulty level. Same standard. This problem says Cassidy walks and bathes dogs. She charges $8.50 if a customer wants a dog bathed and walked, and she charges $5.75 if she only wants the dog walked. Then we see a bulleted list of how many dogs she's either walking or walking and bathing on Saturday and Sunday. And then notice that Cassidy used the following expression to determine the amount of money that she earned walking and bathing dogs last weekend. And pay particular attention that the expression is already given for students. The students are then asked to simplify that expression to find out how much money Cassidy earned walking and bathing dogs that weekend. If we were together, I would poll you and I would ask you to pick a difficulty level between levels 1 and 4. But since we're not all together, I'll just tell you the difficulty level on this question is a level 3. Why, you may wonder? This scores at the meets level. I'm given the expression, I just have to simplify it. The numbers are a bit more complicated. We have some decimals in there you might want to notice. The answer's not given, like on that previous example when they gave us the answer of 24. So more is expected of me this time. There's also a contextual situation, a real-world application wrapped around the numbers. When this was a field test item, 64% of students answered this one correctly. So this is what we would call a meets level question. Let's do another. This time, same standard. The question says, a teacher has some pencils in a bag and some boxes. She's got a bag with 36 unbroken pencils. She has 4 boxes with 120 pencils in each box. There are 6 broken pencils in each box. And she puts half of all the unbroken pencils in a storage cabinet. Which expression can be used to show that the teacher puts 246 pencils in the storage cabinet? And then we have 4 expressions to choose from. If we were all together, I'd poll the room, I would let you talk about it, and then I would tell you that this is a master's level question. More is expected of me as a student with this one. I have to figure out which expression matches that situation first, and then does it simplify down to 246, which is not a simple number like 24 in the first example. This one has context wrapped all around it, and when it was a field test item, only 39% of students answered this question correctly. Data from the field test determines the weight of the test question on STAR. An idea for your PLC. If you were doing this in real life, you might select in advance several high priority standards, and you might print those test questions from Lead Forward IQ item analysis like you see in that image on the right. You might hand those test questions to teachers, maybe in pairs, and ask them to sort them into approaches, meets, or master's levels as seen in that image. Then finally, you might ask the teachers to add some sticky notes describing what they noticed about the rigor of each test question. Let's finish up with a quick discussion about scaled scores and a preview of the new assessment for 2027-28, the SST. Each year, the assessment has a consistent overall difficulty level. However, each year, the test looks a little different. So look at the orange circle as from 2021 to 2024. Some years are pretty easy, and that test question is assessed at a more difficult level in other years. So think about what that means. Look at 2023. That year, the results for that student expectation may look low. However, it was assessed at a really high difficulty level that year. And then the next year, in 2024, the item for that SE, it was a lower difficulty. So if your percentage of correct goes up, you might accidentally think, wow, I must have really taught that great, when really it was just assessed at a lower difficulty level. or it could happen vice versa. If I don't look at the question, maybe I'd incorrectly think that some years I didn't teach a standard well. I need to look at the state data and, more importantly, the question itself. It might be a master's level question, meaning it's more difficult. I don't want to just look from one year to the next. I want to look at trends over several years to see if my instructional approach is aligning well. And most importantly, I really need to examine the test at the question level and determine, is it an approaches, meets, or master's level question? Guys, this is also a concern when teachers make their own CFAs. If I go into Eduphoria and I pick questions that are aligned to the standard, but I pick them all and they happen to all be at an approaches level, then if the STAR assesses at meets and master's level, then I may not have data that is a good predictor of how well my kids are going to do. Here's another caveat. Because the test looks different each year, there's a slight variation, less than a point, of difficulty from year to year. So I want you to pretend that these bowls of fruit are at the grocery store and that you're purchasing them by weight. You put them on a scale, okay? And you're trying to buy 6 pounds of fruit. The first bowl weighs 6.0. The second one weighs 5.9. The third, 6.1 pounds. All of them are very close to 6 pounds with just a small variation, okay? That's true with test design too. All tests must fall within a very tight range of difficulty year after year, but it's not exact. If we get 6.3, for example, it's a slightly more difficult test form. If we get a bowl or a STAR test form that happens to weigh 5.9, it's a slightly easier test form. And that is why Texas doesn't just use raw scores to report achievement. Remember, we have a test that looks different from year to year. We use a variety of assessed curriculum, both readiness and supporting standards. We know the raw score may not be the same each year. A scale score ensures validity and reliability. Why? Because the difficulty level of the test overall will affect the raw score required to earn approaches, meets, and master's performance levels. Think of it this way. If you create a test on your own and you give that exact same test to students year after year, we would call that a static test. Nothing changes about the test itself year after year, and so we could compare raw scores of the students. But if you switch out the questions, assess some standards consistently and other supporting standards pop in and out, you compare raw scores, comparing raw scores doesn't sound quite as equitable, does it? Especially when you consider that every question on STAR was first field tested to determine difficulty weight. Texas doesn't use scaled scores to trick us or to make us think that they're moving the goalpost from year to year. It's just an important component of test reliability and validity. Remember, the raw score is the number of points, not the number of questions. And so why does it appear to shift from year to year? Look at the borderline between meets and meets and approaches. In 2025, a student needed 26 points to score at the meets level. But this year, in the spring of 2026, it only took 25 points. What does this tell you? It tells me that this year's test form was a wee bit more difficult than last year's. Any test forms that are slightly harder, they're going to require fewer points to hit performance levels. But tests on the lower end of the range will require fewer points to hit meets. That's why there's a little bit of slide on the conversion charts each year. We're going to wrap up with what we know so far about the transition from STAR to SST, the Student Success Tool. Starting not this year, everybody hear me loud and clear, starting next year in the school year 2027-28, House Bill 8 replaces STAR with a new assessment for Texas schools named the Student Success Tool, SST. For grades 3 through 8, including Spanish, there will be a required beginning of year, middle of year, and end of year assessment. For EOC in high school, it's optional to do the beginning of year and the middle of year, and then it's a required end of year assessment. English 2 is removed from the EOC list. We probably won't have, I don't really know a lot of information yet, but I'm doubting very seriously that some high schools will opt in or opt out of those EOCs. We'll make a consistent decision across the district. What are the requirements we know so far? Well, we know that the assessments must be shorter than STAR assessments and must be designed to support accommodations for students who need them. We also know that students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are required to only be assessed at the end of the year. And we know, really importantly, that those results must be provided to school systems within 2 business days after the testing window closes. If you want the FAQ that TEA has released, you'll find it linked on this slide. And the blueprints are supposed to be available any day. They tell us in August. And when they are available, they'll be posted to TEA's website, also linked on this slide. The final bit of information that we know about the SST assessment next year is just a brief look at the calendar. We know that for the beginning of year assessments, students will take those in September. The format will be adaptive, meaning that if a student starts answering questions wrong, the test will become easier. And if the student is answering questions consistently correctly, the test will get more difficult. It's to help us gauge their grade level. The question types will be either multiple choice or multiple select. That's because, remember, there's a quick turnaround window of only 2 days, so they have to be able to be graded very quickly. The middle of year will be given in January or February. It also will be adaptive, and it will also be multiple choice or multiple select. For the end of year, there are 2 parts. The writing portion, the ECR for RLA only, will happen in early April. They tell us, at least right now, that ECR will still be tied to some brief text, and then students will write. And then in May, the multiple choice portion of RLA and all of the other content areas, that will happen in May. And it will be static, and meaning it will not be adaptive. It will not try to gauge grade level. It will be more like what we're used to. But it will, again, have that quick turnaround, so it will be multiple choice or multiple select. I hope that going through test design, scale scores, and a quick preview of the SST test coming in 2027 provides you with some good information you can share with your PLC or vertical teams at the beginning of the year. Thanks.